why did Paul write Romans? I think Mike Bird, who's a recent commentator on the letter to the Romans, of course he's commented on the letter to the Romans for a long time. He's an adjunct instructor at Houston Baptist University, but he resides in Melbourne, Australia, where he's dean and chair of a university over there. Dean and chair of a department within a university over there. I think in his recent commentary, he is right to say that we should not reduce what scholars call the occasion, that is to say, the apparent reasons because of which an author wrote the letter which we now have, letter to the Romans. We probably shouldn't reduce the occasion simply to one reason. It appears as though there are several reasons, some of which we can deduce. Paul says later in the letter to the Romans, chapters 15 and 16 in particular, when he's talking about his travel plans, he's going to gather up some more money. He's going to go to Jerusalem and disperse of money which he's gathered from his churches as an offering to the Jerusalem Christians who are experiencing real poverty, and then he's going to make his way to Rome, and thence he hopes on to Spain. But when Paul's talking about his travel plans, he hints at the fact that he's not going to be using Antioch in Syria anymore as a base of operations. Now, we can put that together with what he says in the letter to Galatians, and even really with some material in the book of Acts. We know that after Jesus' death and resurrection, which of course occurs in Jerusalem, that once the Spirit is poured out and the early church gets going, so to speak, there's obviously a huge body of believers in Jerusalem, but not long thereafter, and again, not least in view of persecution of Jerusalem Christians. Small scale, sporadic, but nevertheless persecution of Jewish Christians in Jerusalem. Some Christians, both for practical reasons to avoid persecution and for missiological reasons to go on mission, they go up north, up through Damascus, and of course that's where Paul is pursuing Christians, and into Syria on the eastern coast of the Mediterranean Sea in a place called Antioch. And we know that there was a large Christian community at Antioch, and there actually was for several centuries thereafter. It was a major Christian center. But we know in Antioch there was a Christian church made up of not just Jews that believed that Jesus was the Messiah, but also of Gentiles. So it was a mixed Jewish-Gentile community, not established by Paul, established before Paul, into which Paul has experiences and he participates with them and knows who they are and they know who he is. But Paul recounts an incident in the letter to the Galatians, one of his other tiny, potent letters, and says that there was a time when he and Barnabas, which is an associate, a missionary associate of Paul, are in Antioch, and they're having a meal, a Christian fellowship meal, perhaps the Lord's Supper, but a Christian fellowship meal, and Peter is there, and other Jewish Christians are there, so it's a high profile, so to speak, in terms of leaders in the early Christian community fellowship, and Paul says that certain men came from Jerusalem, from James. James was the brother of Jesus who came to believe in Jesus as Messiah only after his death and resurrection, referred to in 1 Corinthians 15. Well, some folks, some Christians, Jewish Christians, perhaps of Pharisaic bent, came from Jerusalem to Antioch. Now, whether or not they were actual emissaries of James and James authorized them to do and say that, I rather doubt it, but they came from Jerusalem and were hoping to exercise some influence over the situation in Antioch and over the Jew and Gentile fellowship and the nature of that fellowship. And one of the things that they did was to say, hi, folks here, this is a great fellowship which we've got going on, but actually we know that the Torah says that we should eat kosher food, we should keep kosher, we should only have table fellowship with circumcised, fully, thoroughly Jewish people that have, if they are Gentiles by birth, they've been circumcised, their males are circumcised, they adhere to the kosher laws and they keep Sabbath, so they're fully paid up, as it were, adherence to the Jewish law, and if they do that, we can have table fellowship. If not, we can't. And that this message had such an influence on or their arrival and their message had such an influence on Peter and Barnabas and other Jewish Christians that actually it caused a schism, temporarily at least, within the church. That actually, is Paul and folks like him, are they right when they say, actually, no, we have table fellowship, we are the one body of Christ on the basis of the Spirit and baptism, Jesus' death and resurrection were marked out solely by the poured out Spirit, fidelity to Jesus the Messiah, and fidelity to one another. Are they right? Or are these folks right that actually the Jewish prescriptions for what circumcision, Sabbath food laws, those still obtain and we need to obey those? Who's right? Well, again, there was a schism in the church. Peter, in principle, as did Barnabas, agreed with Paul, as probably did James in Jerusalem, I think, as Acts 15 suggests, except that there was simply so much socio-political and religious pressure from these hardline Jewish Christians of a more Pharisaic bent. Okay. What does that tell us about one of the reasons, perhaps, that Paul is writing to the Roman church as well? He seems to have lost his base of operations in Syrian Antioch, where doubtless he and his missionary associates would travel back. They would be given some financial means. They'd be financially supported. They'd be supported in prayer and in assistance in various ways as they would travel west around the Mediterranean world and establish these churches. Well, there's been a schism, and perhaps Paul doesn't have a relationship with them anymore which will sustain his missionary work. So perhaps that's one reason. Again, related to that, but in a sense, in principle, it could be unrelated. Paul wants to go further west, and Rome is a natural base of operations because it's much closer to Spain than is way further to the east, Syrian Antioch. So that's one reason. Another reason is that we get hints from Romans 14 that there are similar debates like there were in Antioch in the Rome, and there were probably similar debates all around the Christian world when Jews and Gentiles were together in fellowship. There were debates in Rome about, do I keep the Sabbath? Do I worry about the Jewish kosher laws? How do Jews and Gentiles have proper fellowship together? So Paul's concerned about that issue. That's part of the reason that he writes. There seems to be an issue not just in the Roman churches, and I say churches because you'll see in Romans 16 when Paul refers to the churches in Rome, he refers to many small house churches, and it's not clear how those churches get along one with another. And so he's writing to several churches, but when Paul writes the letter to the Romans, it's clear that either lots of churches are having this issue, the church in Rome is having this issue in particular, I think probably lots of churches have this issue, and Paul was getting a reputation for this issue. Because his missionary work was being so successful with non-Jewish Gentiles who perhaps had been people that were sympathetic to the Jewish faith prior to hearing anything about Jesus, but nevertheless, they were coming to the movement in numbers which seem far to have outweighed the number of Jews that were saying, yes, Jesus is the Messiah. Yes, this is what's happened. Yes, we're on board with this. Well, that created a problem for Paul's missionary, theological, preaching work, etc. Had God simply rejected his people? Was God simply writing them off and saying, actually, I created a world, it went wrong with Adam and Eve. I called Abraham and made a covenant so that they would be the elect people in and through whom I would bless them, but also through them bless the nations, as the promise to Abraham says several times in the book of Genesis. Had God simply said, well, that covenant didn't work. That was plan A. Let's try plan B. I'll send Jesus, and then I'll rescue all these Gentiles. Is that the message that Paul is proclaiming? And that seems to have been a problem. And Paul is very concerned throughout the letter to the Romans to make the case that God has not been unfaithful to his promises to and through Israel. God has remained faithful to the covenant with Israel to bless her, the covenant through Israel to bless the nations through her. How has he been faithful? In and through Israel's representative Messiah, Jesus, and in and through lots of Jews that have, in fact, even though not as many as the Gentiles, joined the movement, Paul being among them. And so Paul seems concerned to set out his theology, his very Jewish theology of the faithfulness of God to the covenants. That seems to be another reason why he's written the letter. Again, there might be a historical contingent issue going on. We know that Claudius, the Roman emperor, in the late 40s and 50s, had expelled the Jews from Rome for various reasons, and that possibly that had created among the Romans an anti-Jewish sentiment. We know that it was common in the ancient world to have an anti-Jewish sentiment. We have lots of Greco-Roman sources which embody as much and propagate as much. So it's possible that the Roman churches simply were dominated by influential Gentiles, and that they were getting the sense that that's right, God has written off his Jewish people, and we're now the people that God is doing business with. And perhaps that is the context of the barbed critique in Romans 13, where Paul is emphatic, Romans 11, where Paul is emphatic that actually it's Israel that is God's chosen people. Israel, the elect remnant in and as Israel's Messiah Jesus is the root. Gentiles included in that family are the branches. It isn't the other way around. Gentiles are included into a Jewish story of God's covenant faithfulness. They're not some sort of plan B. So that seems to have been perhaps another reason why Paul writes. Paul writes as well, Romans isn't a systematic theology, but for some reason it seems to be the case that Rome is a church, as an aside, that Paul has not established. They don't know him well, he doesn't know them well. So it just seems to be the case that as well, I caution, Romans is not Paul's systematic theology where he says everything he would say about systematic categories like God and human purpose and human sin and salvation, etc. Nevertheless, Romans is a letter which manifestly sets out in a grand scheme what Paul thinks about God's purposes and what God has accomplished from the creation of the world all the way up to his own day. And so while we want to say that Romans isn't per se a systematic theology, we shouldn't therefore reduce Romans to. There are historically contingent reasons why Romans is such a large-scale, coherent vision, and why theologians from Paul's day to this have found it a huge mansion, rich and beautiful to live in. So that pretty much situates the letter to the Romans, and now what I'd like to do in subsequent posts is simply to work through some major features of the letter so that you get a sense of course, the commentary that you'll be reading will help with that, but I also want to flag up some things in the letter for you to be thinking about.